My expectation is that most of the worst of the rioting will be behind us. The worst of it, I think we saw was last weekend, when really the culmination of this kind of exploitation of this tragedy by far-right rioters really happened, because they were able to build up so much momentum. Of course, we saw that horrible tragedy happened in the UK town of Southport, and really since then we saw a huge amount of disinformation and misinformation appear from far-right sources, and that really produced this kind of huge reaction in various towns across the UK, and I say that really culminated in a whole bunch of rioting that happened last weekend. But really there's been a pretty major response both from the government and from law enforcement then. We've had the police confirm this afternoon that 595 people have been detained since then. About 160 of them have been charged. And we're seeing quite sort of tough sentences imposed against them, which I think is really part of the kind of tactical response that the law enforcement is taking against them, with a view that actually if rioters see very swift justice against people who are taking the law into their own hands, that actually that will have a deterrent effect. Of course, we saw the far right trying to do the same thing on Wednesday of this week. They released on Telegram a list of about 100 targets that were related to do with immigration services, such as immigration law firms, and called again for their supporters to mobilise. But the reality was actually a humiliation for the far right. We actually saw thousands of counter-demonstrators across the UK appear, and really only a handful of far-right individuals at each of those. I was present at one in North Finchley in North London, and really the response from counter-protesters was overwhelming. So I think there is a chance of further unrest this weekend, where things typically kick off, but I think it's I would suspect it, the worst is really behind us.
So this whole narrative of far right being behind these or responsible, the larger question here would be whether the far rights would kind of prompt or trigger a national level discussion, the larger concern about the immigration laws, given that one of the writers, they're citing this as one of the major concerns, or rather the major concern, apparently.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's how they tried to instigate really all this unrest, by originally stating that the suspect involved in the tragedy last week was a Muslim asylum seeker. And in fact, we found out from the police that in fact they weren't. They were British born and they weren't Muslim. But despite that fact, they still sought to take the law into their own hands and riot. But you're absolutely right. Of course, there has been some debate over immigration triggered since then. But I think, to my mind, certainly when you have a situation where people are enacting racist violence, when you have what could really only be described as sort of racist lynch mobs, attacking people in the street who look anything remotely foreign to them, trying to burn down hotels with asylum seekers, and when you have consequently, millions of people who of colour, across the UK who are feeling fearful because of that, those are not the kind of social economic conditions in which it is appropriate to kind of be having a discussion about the composition of society. So I imagine that there are people that still want to talk about migration, and of course there are some politicians, particularly on the right, who are trying to use this to bring up those issues. But really, the reality is immigration is discussed quite heavily in the UK. We've seen the government, or the previous government, Conservative governments, repeatedly talk about the dangers of immigration to the public. And I think, when you have a situation where the highest politicians of the country are repeatedly telling the public that migrants could be a danger, that does have an impact on the ground. So really, I think, migration is something that is heavily talked about in the UK.
Okay,
but I think
Adam,
in this situation, it's not something that we should be talking about right now, to be honest.
Right. But Adam, what do you really read into the responses that are coming from political biggies or figures like Nigel Farage to sort of legitimize these far right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to bring it up. And, very quickly after the tragedy, we actually saw Nigel Farage promote these kind of conspiracies. He actively said there may be a police cover-up over the background of the suspect. And of course, for an elected politician, for the leader of a political party, the Reform Party, to say something like that is very incendiary. It's very, insightful to kind of say that. So I think, really, to my mind, to the mind of many other people, those kinds of comments are deeply reckless and actually are partly responsible for the legitimization of the violence that we've seen across cities. But I think perhaps more concerning as that is going to be the impact that it has on the Conservative leadership election. As we know, Rishi Sunak standing down, and so we've already seen some contenders for that trying to pick up some of these issues involved. So I think that's really the bigger kind of political issue.
and implications for social media given the misinformation campaign, which seems to be very difficult to contain.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I would say what we've seen over the last 10 days or so has really been a case study for the dangers of badly run and, poorly regulated social media. The reality is that we've seen misinformation and disinformation unchecked, spread across social platforms, and that caused, the consequences of which we have seen are so serious. But I think really the government has various different policy tools that it could use. It could continue trying to enforce criminal legislation in the online realms, which I think it is doing, so it could strengthen that. It could try to engage formally with social media companies to try to create some kind of industry government collaboration on the way that they should be run, or it could go for something a little bit more draconian and try to enforce requirements on social media firms to cut down on this kind of activity through legislation. I think the reality is probably a combination of all of those is going to be the best path forward for the Starmer government.
Yeah, Adam, we'd also like to understand from you. Now, many writers apparently are describing themselves as patriots and claiming that high immigration levels were undermining British society. What is the backstory?
Well, of course, patriotism is one of the kind of retreats to which people on the far right kind of retreat to. But the reality, to my mind, is that patriots don't go around attacking police officers. They don't go around burning hotels. They don't go around attacking libraries and places of worship. The real patriots, in my view, are the people who, in the mornings afterwards, actually came out and tried to clean up some of the mess. They tried to rebuild some of the damage that they did. We've seen, £200,000 raised for a library that was destroyed. Those are the people who are really fighting for British values, in my opinion.
Unacceptable. But they argued also that the immigration fueled violence and that these crimes, violence and crimes, and that the politicians have been favoring migrants. Now, how uphill or how challenging do you think all this is going to be for the Starmer regime to contain this, considering this is something which has erupted soon after he took over and he already had a very long, to-do list?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that, migration, issues to do with migration are very challenging to deal with. And I think it's particularly difficult for Starmer, who has tried to sort of position himself in the political centre on this issue, to try to acknowledge concerns that the public have over immigration. But I think, we're going to see a sort of much more, sort of solutions-based response from the government, from, let's say, compared to the previous Conservative governments, which really tried to kind of politically weaponize this issue. I think the reality is that there's nothing politically Starmer can do to try to contain this violence in terms of, creating some kind of policy response. I don't think that would be appropriate. And of course, Starmer has a limited role over the things he can do in terms of law and order, because it's ultimately for the independent police force to do. But I think really what Starmer is trying to do is to create a deterrent, as I mentioned, through enabling the courts to kind of swiftly deliver justice. But I think long term, the thing that really combats far right extremism and issues to do with concern over immigration is actually, real programs in society to kind of increase exposure of people to different cultures, to try to make economic growth inclusive. So I think really, the Starmer government has got those major challenges to focus on if it really wants to kind of bring the country together and to make sure that really no one in society is excluded and really feels that one group is prioritized over the other.